So we're first going to start off with the show it. I'll just kind of read through the questions for the show it, and then we will go through our lesson, and then we'll kind of answer the questions of the show it after our lesson. So in our Buzz page, once we go to week of December 14th on Monday, and we open up our show it. So there's 7 questions with the show it. So the first one, it's asking us, the Aztec people probably began as a tribe of what? So who did they begin as? What were they classified as? So we'll type in that answer there. Number 2, it says, what was the sign that the Aztecs received that told them to settle in central Mexico? So what was the sign that it was kind of an old urban tale of what told them to kind of stop and settle in this one location? So we'll talk about that as we go through the lesson. Number 3, it says, what is the capital city of the Aztecs? So what is the capital city that they settled in of the Aztec Empire? Number 4, it says, what did the Aztecs do with the prisoners of war? So the Aztecs were a very violent society. And so when they captured a new tribe, captured a new town, what did they do with those prisoners? So we'll talk about that. Number 5, it says, the Aztecs ruled up to 500 small states, so small cities or villages. And how many people was that total? So at the very height of their power, how many people were a part of the Aztec civilization? Number 6, it says, which of the Aztecs' inventions played a major role in the Aztec religion and rituals? And then number 7, it says, what was the name of the Spanish conquistador that ended the Aztec Empire? So who was the Spanish warrior and explorer that kind of ended the Spanish or the Aztec Empire? Okay, so we'll answer all those questions after we go through our lesson today. So all you got to do for the lesson is just listen along. I'll kind of circle a few things on a couple of slides. So if I circle it, it might be good to write it down because it could help you with the show it or could help you with an assignment later in the week. But other than that, you just got to make sure you're listening. And then as we go through the show it together, I'll ask for some people to help me answer those questions. Okay. So the Aztecs, who were they? So the Aztecs started as a group of hunters and gatherers. So they started as a group mainly as hunters and gatherers. So remember we talked about as the first people in the Americas, as they walked around, they were traveling and kind of exploring the land. And the way that they were moving from place to place is because they were hunting and gathering different resources. So the Aztecs began as hunters and gatherers. So they had to hunt for their food, hunting different animals like coyotes and mammoths and rabbits that were out and about for their meat. And they also gathered these different fruits and other grains as well as they saw them in the fields as they walked by. So they didn't know how to grow their food yet. They didn't know certain ways to hunt some different animals, but their main way that they were known as first was hunters and gatherers. So that was their kind of first settling point. And these Aztecs, they were very noble, so they're very wise, and they instilled these great morals into their heritage. So they instilled these great morals that would be into their heritage that they would teach their younger generation. All righty. And then, however, the Aztecs were basically known as a savage group of people. So they were a very savage group of people, and they had a number of deaths where at the hands of the Aztecs was vast. So they had a very large amount of deaths that they caused, which we'll talk about here in a second. They were very fierce warriors, and they basically killed anybody that didn't want to become a part of their society. So as they began to expand their civilization and they came across these many villages and towns, they forced those people to join their society. And if they didn't join, then they were killed off. Okay. So the Aztecs were very violent and fierce warriors, and they would kill a lot of people in their quest to become the biggest civilization in Mexico area. All right. But they started as hunters and gatherers. So that's our key phrase from this slide. Okay. So where did they live? Where were they located? So they were located mainly in central Mexico. So they were located mainly in central Mexico. So just a little bit north of the Mayans. And we'll take a look at a map here in just a second on the next slide. But they settled in central Mexico. So they finally stopped and settled in one location in the year 1100 AD. And they established this great city known as Tenochtitlan by 1420. And Tenochtitlan became their capital city. Their main focus of their empire. And so this is a little picture of Tenochtitlan down at the bottom of the great temples and pyramids and palaces and plazas that they built within the city, that kind of made this grand and major city. And the city of Tenochtitlan is actually built on an island. So it's built on an island, and it's on this island of Lake Texcoco. Texcoco is this lake in Mexico, and that's where the capital city of Tenochtitlan is located. And this is actually where Mexico City is located today. So Tenochtitlan is the same location of Mexico City. And remember, we talked about Mexico City a while back, and Mexico City is located on this island as well. And remember, this island is just sinking just a little bit every year. And so it's slowly sinking into this lake. But at the time that they built this island, to first start off, there was many areas of land that would help them survive. So the construction of the city was this big engineering feat, basically built on the backs of human laborers. So they had a lot of slaves and indentured servants that were working to build this very grand city. And you can see just how major and big these palaces and temples were. And they also pulled dirt from the bottom of the lake to help make the bridges to shore. So in order to get to the mainland, so the land that was on the outside of the lake, so in order to get from the island to the mainland, they had to build their own bridges. And the way that they did that was they would dig the dirt up from the bottom of the lake and kind of make this pile of dirt, and this big pile spread all the way across to connect from the island to the mainland. So they had to build these own pathways and own bridges to make sure they could go back and forth from the city to the mainland. Okay. Savannah, I'll go back here. So then we don't have to write down too much, just a few things. So we just said they were hunters and gatherers, Savannah. Hunters and gatherers. Okay. And then how they started their city. So the very grand city. We'll talk about Tenochtitlan here in just a few slides. Let's take a look at a map of where the Aztecs were located. So the colored portion of this map here is where the main strong point of the Aztecs were located. So Tenochtitlan is right there in the middle of this orange region. And so that was the main core states of the Aztec Empire. And so the states here, as they're talking about, the states are basically like the little towns or villages. So there was over 500 cities or states that were part of this empire. And this is just a little bit north of the Mayan civilization. So the Mayans were right off the map here on the side, and we could just go up a little bit north in Mexico, and that's where we find the Aztecs. So the Aztec civilization started a couple years after, or a couple hundred years after, 100 or 200 years after the Mayan civilization ended. So that's just kind of as they ended. Then maybe the Aztecs could have been part of the Mayans as well. We're going to go through the show. Don't worry about answering any of the show questions right now. We're going to answer all of them after the slideshow here. So just kind of be patient, just listen along. All righty. And then the map on the right shows you where Tenochtitlan is located. So here's the island of Tenochtitlan in Lake Texcoco. And so the island here, and they had to build their own bridges to connect back to the mainland. So they had to build these own bridges to connect them, so that way they could go and get resources from other areas and connect to their empire. So the main strong point of Tenochtitlan is it was a very strong capital because it was protected. So if there was an enemy tribe trying to come and capture Tenochtitlan, you could see that enemy coming in any direction because they didn't have many ships back then. They had canoes, but the canoes, you could see the canoes being paddled across the lake. You could see the people, if they were charging across their bridges, you could see them coming and you would be able to prepare and protect the city itself. So Tenochtitlan was in a very strategic location. All righty. And so some other things, let's talk about the agriculture of the Aztec Empire. So the Aztec built this great advanced system of agriculture with the reclaimed swampland. They cultivated the land and had made big crop irrigation. So they actually used their advanced farming methods such as terracing and artificial islands to help them grow the crops that they needed. So this picture on the right here shows you the terraces. And so the terraces were kind of these built-in steps in the sides of a mountain. So they'd actually carve out these steps in the sides of a mountain, and that's where they would build their, that's where they would grow their crops. That's where they would build their farm beds. So they would grow their crops in the sides of the mountain here, and these steps would kind of hold the water. So the water would be used to grow the crops, and the crops needed the water in order to grow. And it was just kind of a brand new way of farming that the Aztecs invented, and it helped them survive for many years. And so they grew many crops such as corn or maize, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, and avocados. And these are all crops that are still actually grown today in this area. So the Aztecs were the first ones to kind of start that trend of growing these types of crops in Mexico. And so another way that they cropped is they would build these artificial islands. So they would build these like 10 feet by 10 feet islands that would float on the lake, and they would build these out of wood. So these islands would float on the lake, and they would get the water from the lake. So they would just grow and get the water from the lake right below them, and they would grow certain crops just on these artificial islands. So these artificial farm beds were just kind of floating on the lake. And that was another way that they grew a lot of their crops. So terracing and artificial islands helped them grow maize, corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, and avocados. So those are the main staples of the Aztec meal. And so not only did they grow a lot of food, but they also hunted a lot of food as well. So they had other resources of food. And the Aztecs, they fished. So since they were located mainly on an island there, their capital city was on an island, and they were located around a lot of water, they could fish a lot. So they used spears and other fishing techniques to kind of capture some of those fish. They hunted rabbits, armadillos, snakes, coyotes, and wild turkeys as well. So the way that they kind of used their weapons, so remember, the weapons that the Aztecs had were only these sharp spears that they had. They had knives that they made out of flint, and they had a little bit of bow and arrows as well. They began to create these bow and arrows too. So those were the only major weapons that the Aztecs had in order to fish, and in order to hunt, and in order to protect themselves with their warriors. Okay, so let's again talk about Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan is the capital city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan. And so Tenochtitlan, it's spread to an area surrounding the lake. So this just kind of shows you the bridges that they built to connect to the mainland. And so you have these very big major plaza right in the middle, and then the homes and other small buildings are around the plaza. And so at one point, Tenochtitlan was actually the largest city in the Americas, and at one point it was actually the largest one in the world. Today, it's still one of the largest ones in North America. It's one of the largest in terms of population. Okay, and at its peak, the Aztec civilization went from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and it also reached from central Mexico to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So it had a big stronghold in central Mexico. Okay, and that's the Aztec civilization. And Tenochtitlan was the main capital, the Aztec capital of the Aztec civilization. So Tenochtitlan, the main capital. And now let's get to who were these Aztecs. The Aztecs, the main thing that we know about the Aztecs is they were strong warriors. They had a very strong military, and they were considered to be a military empire. All right, so they were very strong, and they wanted to take over as many of the tribes around them as they could in order to grow their population, in order to grow their civilization. So there was many tribes and villages living in the wilderness around and throughout Mexico. And so the Aztecs had the idea to kind of unite or force unite all of these tribes and to make these one giant civilization. So they would go from village to village, tribe to tribe, and kind of basically they gave the village two choices. They could join the Aztec civilization peacefully, or they would be killed. Okay, so there were two choices: join or be killed. And so they formed alliances, the Aztecs did. They formed alliances with other tribes, the other tribes that would agree with them, to eliminate their rivals. So there were still other tribes in Mexico that would not agree with them and became the Aztec rivals. And they would eventually be destroyed or killed because of such a strong force that the Aztecs were. And so once the Aztec took over a town or a village, they took over anything in that village. So they conquered all of the resources. So they took items such as the maize, copper, cotton cloth, and weapons were confiscated by the Aztecs. So once they took over the village, then whatever was in the village became a part of the Aztec civilization. And then the people that were fighting against, so the warriors that were fighting against the Aztecs, so if you were fighting against the Aztecs and you were captured then you were forced into slavery. So you were put to work. You were put to manual labor in the Aztec civilization. So if you were a soldier fighting against the Aztecs and you were captured in a battle or in a war, then you were forced and put into slavery. So you were forced to work off your debt in order to be a member of the Aztec civilization. So you either forced to work or you were killed. So mainly if you were captured in battle, you were forced and put into slavery. And so that's the key form there. And then at the very height of the Aztec civilization, they ruled about 5 to 6 million people. So at the very height of the civilization, there was about 5 to 6 million people that were ruled through commerce or conquest. So as they captured town to town, village to village, tribe to tribe, their population grew and grew and got up to be about 5 to 6 million people. Okay, so they're very strong military presence. Very strong military presence. Alrighty, whenever they captured a soldier, then they were forced into slavery. And then some other different things about the Aztecs, so the Aztec economy. So the Aztec economy, how they made money, it thrived on busy markets. So markets was the center of their economy. And in the market, they sold a lot of different items, such as food and goods and jewelry and feathers were some other things that they sold. And many, many people would attend these markets. So you could see about maybe even as much as 50,000 people a day in the market. So the markets were attended very heavily. So a bunch of people would visit these markets every single day, and that's how that kind of helped keep their family alive, get the resources that they needed in order to cook the meals that they needed. And so they could trade different items. They could get items such as jewelry, rubber, cacao beans, and feathers, and all sorts of other foods and items that would be necessary for daily life. So the markets were a very popular place to be, and that's how the money was kind of spread throughout the Aztec Empire. And then the social structure. So who had the most power in the system? So the Aztecs had a strict or a structured social structure with a very strict caste system. So at the top were the nobles. So the nobles were a very small class, like the priests and the religious leaders and the political leaders. So they had an emperor at the very top. So the emperor was in charge. And then he had 3 people below him that kind of helped him make decisions. So the emperor had the most power, and he was viewed as a god, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he had 3 people right below him that kind of helped him make decisions, and then you had the religious leaders as well that were a part of this noble class. And then below them were the serfs, and then indentured servants and slaves. And then the merchants also had a category of their own, which was right below the nobles. So it went the nobles at the very top who had the most power, and then right below them were the merchants, or the people that went and traded and bought different goods. Then below them was the serfs. So the serfs were the people that were like farmers and just kind of worked to kind of make some different materials. And then you have the servants, indentured servants below them. So indentured servants were people that worked manual labor, and they were paid for it. So they were paid to work some manual labor to either to build the plazas, build the buildings, to help kind of work in the markets. So indentured servants were paid to do manual labor. And then at the very bottom were slaves. So slaves were forced to do manual labor. They didn't get any incentive to do the work. They were forced to work. And mainly the main group of slaves in this case were the people that were captured in war. So if you were captured in a battle by the Aztecs, then you were forced into slavery and forced to work. All right, just a few more slides here. And then the Aztec religion. So the Aztec religion is very similar to the Mayans as well. So they worship many gods. They had many gods that they worship, mainly based on nature. So they had a god basically for every aspect of life. And so again, like the Aztecs, they believed that human sacrifice was necessary to keep the gods happy and to ensure an abundant harvest. So they believed in human sacrifice as well, and offering blood up to the gods, and that would keep them happy and help them keep them safe and to help them grow a lot of crops. And they had thousands of prisoners who were actually sacrificed as well. So another part of, if you were captured in war, if you were not put into slavery, then you were also part of the human sacrifice. So they you as a human sacrifice as well to keep the gods happy. And they built these beautiful temples, palaces, and plazas and statues that were dedicated to their many gods. But the main center of their religion was the Aztec calendar. So the calendar was the main central part of their religion. And this calendar was based on a sun cycle, which lasted about 365 days. So actually, this calendar is very similar to the calendar that we use today, because our calendar is based off of our ability to revolve around the sun. So the Earth revolves around the sun. And then the calendar goes 365 days, just like our calendar goes around that same time as well, 365 days. Okay, so we have a very similar calendar to the Aztecs, and the calendar played a huge role in religion and rituals. So the Aztec calendar helped them realize when to perform certain religious ceremonies, when to have different human sacrifices, when to grow certain crops. So the calendar was a very important resource for their religion. So it played a huge role in kind of performing these human sacrifices, when to grow certain crops, and when to perform these certain rituals. So it's a lot similar, very similar to the calendar that we use today that lets us know when to celebrate certain holidays and when to expect different seasons. Okay. And then lastly, the government. So the government, the Aztec government, it was set up where they would have a 4-person council that was stationed in Tenochtitlan. And the leader of that 4-person council was the emperor. So the emperor at the very top of the government structure, and then right below him were 3 people that were kind of his advisors, and they made all the decisions for the Aztec Empire. And the emperor was treated as a god, and he was supported by everyone. So he was viewed as a god, he was treated as a god, and so he was viewed and treated by everyone, or with respect as well. And then the most famous emperor, or one of the most famous emperors in the Aztecs, was Moctezuma II. And he was one of the last emperors of the Aztec Empire before they collapsed. And he was very impactful because of the way he led the Aztecs and kind of protecting their city and protecting Tenochtitlan against these invaders. So he was actually the leader when the Spanish came over and captured the Aztecs. So who were the Spanish? So the end of the empire, how the Aztecs ended. So unlike the Mayans, we actually know exactly how the Aztec civilization ended. And it ended at the hands of European explorers who came over and were exploring this new land and took over from the Aztecs. So a gentleman named Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish conquistador, so he was the leader of the Spanish army, he first led his soldiers to the Aztec civilization. So Hernan Cortez was the leader of the Spanish conquistadors, and they brought over they had a couple of advantages that helped them take over the Aztecs pretty easily. So the first advantage was they had an advanced weapon system. So they had, unlike the Aztecs who only had spears and bow and arrows and little knives, the Spanish actually had weapons such as guns and cannons that they would use that would be much more impactful rather than the weapons of the Aztecs. And the Spanish also had armor. So this metal armor that they would wear that would protect them from the spears and bow and arrows that were used by the Aztecs. So the Spanish had a very advanced and very more superior weapon system than the Aztecs. And another thing that kind of helped the Spanish was in Europe, they had these many different diseases and sicknesses that the Spanish had. And by then, the Spanish were used to it because they would get them almost every year. But once they traveled over to the New World and to the Aztec civilization, and they brought those diseases and sicknesses with them, the Aztecs were not used to them. So the Aztecs did not have the medicine or the ability to cure these diseases. So the diseases that the Spanish brought over, they spread through the Aztec population rapidly and killed a lot of the Aztec population. So disease was the main reason why the Aztecs kind of lost a lot of their population, because they were killed off by these diseases brought over by the Spanish. So by 1521, the diseases that the Spanish brought over were very deadly to the Aztecs. And by 1521, the Spanish had defeated the Aztecs and their empire was over. So very quick takeover by Hernan Cortez and the Spanish conquistadors, because of the diseases and the advanced weapon system that they had, allowed them to take over the Aztecs pretty quickly. Okay, so it was a very quick and rapid decline of the Aztec Empire. So that is just a brief overview of the Aztec Empire. And we'll go a little bit more in depth later in the week of how they compare to the Mayans and the Incas, who we'll cover tomorrow. But now let's go back to our show it. and then we'll answer these questions together. Okay, so let's go ahead and you guys can go ahead and open up your Show It. So remember, if you go to Q2 assignments, then you go to week of December 14th, and then you go to the Aztec Civilization Show It. Open that up, and we'll go through it together. All righty. Yes, Kayla. So the Mayans were actually an older, so they were around before the Aztecs were. So the Mayans ended around about 100 or 200 years before the Aztec civilization became to power. Okay. So you guys will help me out answer these questions. So number one, it says the Aztec people probably began as a tribe of what? So what were they classified at? How did they begin? What do we think? Kayla T, what do we think?
Hunters and gatherers.
Perfect. So for number one, we'll just put hunters and gatherers is how they began. So they began as a tribe of hunters and gatherers. So remember, they began by hunting their food, walking around from place to place, hunting their animals as they went along, and then gathering up those fruits and grains that they saw as well. So hunters and gatherers will be your answer for number one. All righty. And then for the rest of the question, they're all multiple choice. And so they're going to be in a little bit of a different order on your screen than they will be on my screen. So make sure you're reading through it on your screen carefully. Okay. So number two, it says, what was the sign that the Aztecs received that told them to settle in Central America? So this wasn't in the slideshow, but it was actually, yes.
What was the first one?
Hunters and gatherers.
Okay.
So this wasn't in the slideshow, but this answer is actually in your read it, but I'll just kind of go over right now. But so when the Aztec civilization first started, and as they were hunting and gathering, and as they were moving from place to place, they were just kind of walking around and didn't really have a clue of what to do next until they saw this one sign that they saw. So as they were walking across, they got to that island of Tenochtitlan, and they saw across on the island, they saw this eagle. And this eagle was perched on this cactus. So this eagle was just sitting on this cactus in the middle of this island. And they thought that this was a sign from God, from their gods, that they should settle on that island and begin the civilization. So it's kind of an old urban tale that the Aztecs saw this eagle perched on this cactus, and that's where they knew that they should stop and start forming this grand civilization. So for number two, the answer is just going to be an eagle perched on a cactus in the marshland. So number two is just going to be an eagle perched on a cactus in the marshland. So that helped them kind of realize that they should stop, settle there, and then grow their civilization from there. And it worked out pretty well because the city that they grew, Tenochtitlan, is still around today. It's known as Mexico City, and it's still one of the most populated cities in the world. Okay. So number three, it says, what is the capital city of the Aztecs? So out of those four answers there, what do we think is the capital city of the Aztecs? So we have Texcoco, Tenochtitlan, Chichen Itza, and Tehuacan. So what do we think? What do we think? Kylie, what do we think?
Tenochtitlan.
Perfect, Tenochtitlan. So make sure you're selecting the correct answer here because it's pretty close in spelling. So Tenochtitlan is spelled Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan. That's the capital city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan. So it's on Lake Texcoco. It's on Lake Texcoco, but the capital city is actually known as Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan. Okay, so Tenochtitlan is going to be your answer for number three. Then number four, it says, what did the Aztecs do with their prisoners of war? So if you were captured and by the Aztecs, what was the main thing that they did to you? Did they kill you? Did they force you into slavery? Or did they set you free as members of their society? Savannah, what do you think for that one?
Forced them into slavery.
Perfect. So they forced you into slavery. So if you were captured into war, then they forced you into slavery there. So you're going to be your answer for number four. All righty. Number five, It says the Aztecs ruled up to 500 small states and how many people? So the very height of their civilization, how many people were a part of the Aztec civilization? How many people total? Okay, let's see. What do you think?
2 to 3 million people.
Not quite. A little bit more than that.
Okay. 5 to 6 million.
There you go. 5 to 6 million people. 5 to 6 million people were at the very height of their civilization. So 5 to 6 million people were the kind of at the very height of their civilization. That's how many people were a part of the Aztecs. So as they took over more villages, more tribes, they grew up to be about 5 to 6 million people strong. Then number 6, it says, which of the Aztecs' inventions played a major role in the Aztecs' religion and rituals? So which one of those, was it a calendar, architecture, writing, or number system that played a major role in the Aztecs' religious ceremonies? Emmeline, what do you think?
Wasn't it the calendar?
The calendar, perfect. So the calendar helped them decide when to perform certain rituals, when to do some religious ceremonies, when to grow certain crops. So the calendar was the main reason, our main rule of the Aztecs' religion and rituals. And then lastly, number 7, it says, what was the name of the Spanish conquistador that ended the Aztec Empire? So who was the name of the Spanish conquistador that ended the Aztec Empire? Who was the leader? Was it Hernan Cortez, Moctezuma II, or Christopher Columbus? What do we think for this one? Sophia?
Montezuma II.
Not him. He was actually the Aztec emperor. So not Moctezuma. So who was the Spanish conquistador? Who was the leader of the Spanish conquistador? Kylie, do we know?
Hernan Cortez.
Bingo, Hernan Cortez. So Hernan Cortez is actually the answer for number 7. Okay. So going back through these. So number 1, we said the Aztecs were known as hunters and gatherers first. So they began as hunters and gatherers. Number 2, the story of where they began to settle. They remember the old urban tale. They saw this eagle that was perched on a cactus in the marshland. That's what kind of told them to settle in one location. Number 3 was Tenochtitlan. That's the capital city of the Aztecs. Number 4, the people that were prisoners of war, they were forced them into slavery. So forced them into slavery once they were captured. Number 5, at the very height of their power, there was about 5 to 6 million people that were part of the Aztec civilization. Number 6, the center of the Aztec religion was the calendar. And then number 7, the Spanish conquistador that ended the Aztec Empire was Hernan Cortez. All righty, so those are your answers for the show it for today.